I never thought it would happen to me. Not in a million years. I was the faithful wife, the one who held it all together, the one who knew where every sock and receipt was. But there I was, sitting on the edge of a bed that wasn't mine, beside a woman who had just turned my world upside down. It all started innocently, or at least I'd convinced myself it had. We met at a charity event, one of those pretentious galas my husband dragged me to so he could rub elbows with people he hardly liked. She was there with her own husband, and we'd ended up seated at the same table. Her name was Claire, and she was magnetic in a way that made the entire room disappear when she spoke. Her laugh was contagious, her smile disarming. I remember thinking how lucky her husband was to have her. I'd never imagined that thought would lead to what came next. The first time we really spoke, it was over wine. Too much wine. My husband had gone off to schmooze, and Claire's husband was locked in some heated discussion about stocks or politics. We'd been left to entertain ourselves, and it didn't take long before we found ourselves laughing like old friends. She told me about her career, her passions, her dreams. I told her about my life, the life I'd built with my husband, the life that felt more like a perfectly curated Instagram feed than something real. She understood me in a way I hadn't expected, and it was intoxicating. It wasn't long before we exchanged numbers. It was innocent at first, or at least that's what I told myself. We texted about books, about recipes, about things that had nothing to do with the husbands who filled our evenings and weekends. But beneath the surface, there was something more. A tension I couldn't name but couldn't ignore. The first time we met for coffee, I felt like a teenager sneaking out after curfew. My heart raced as I walked into the cafe and saw her sitting there, her hair falling effortlessly over one shoulder. She looked up, smiled, and for a moment I forgot how to breathe. We talked for hours, and when I finally looked at the time, I realized I'd missed 3 calls from my husband. I told him I'd been caught up with errands, and he didn't question it. He never did. As the weeks went by, our coffee dates turned into lunches, then dinners, then nights where we stayed out far too late. I'd tell my husband I was meeting friends, and he'd nod absent-mindedly, barely looking up from his phone. It was almost too easy, and that terrified me. How had we gotten to this point? How had I let myself get so close to someone who wasn't my husband? The first time it happened, I was a mess of nerves. Claire had invited me to her studio, a space she used for painting, a passion she'd rediscovered after years of putting it on hold for her family. The room smelled of turpentine and lavender, and her unfinished works lined the walls. She'd poured us glasses of wine, and we'd talked until the conversation drifted into silence. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, though. It was heavy, charged, like the air before a storm. When she leaned in, I didn't pull away. I told myself it was the wine, the atmosphere, the way her eyes seemed to hold all the answers to questions I hadn't dared to ask. But deep down, I knew it wasn't any of those things. It was her. And it was me. And it was something neither of us could stop. The guilt was immediate. A suffocating wave that followed me home and wrapped itself around me like a second skin. I'd lie awake at night, my husband sleeping soundly beside me, and wonder how I could have done it. How I could have crossed a line I'd sworn I never would. But no matter how guilty I felt, I couldn't stay away. Claire was a drug and I was addicted. We told ourselves it wasn't serious, that it didn't mean anything, that it was just a way to escape the monotony of our lives. But the more time we spent together, the harder it became to believe those lies. I'd catch myself smiling at my phone when her name popped up, rearranging my schedule just to see her for a few stolen moments. I was falling for her, and it terrified me. One night, my husband confronted me. He'd noticed the late nights, the excuses, the way I'd pull away when he tried to kiss me. "Is there someone else?" he asked, his voice breaking in a way that made my chest ache. I wanted to tell him the truth, to lay it all out and beg for his forgiveness. But I couldn't. Not yet. So I lied. "Of course not," I said, forcing a laugh. "You're imagining things." But he wasn't imagining things, and neither was I. The walls were closing in, And I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. The breaking point came on a night I'll never forget. Claire and I had planned to meet at her studio, but when I arrived, she was different. Distant. She wouldn't look me in the eye, wouldn't touch me. Finally, she blurted it out. Her husband had found out. He'd gone through her phone, seen the messages, the photos, the parts of our lives we'd tried so hard to keep hidden. "What are we doing?" she asked, her voice trembling. "This can't last. We're going to ruin everything." I didn't know what to say. She was right. We'd been reckless, selfish, blind to the consequences of our actions. But even as she spoke, I couldn't imagine letting her go. "I love you," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I thought she might say it back. But she didn't. Instead, she shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't do this anymore." And just like that, it was over. The aftermath was a blur of pain and regret. Claire and her husband moved away, and I was left to pick up the pieces of a life I'd shattered. My husband never found out the full truth, though I think he suspected. Our marriage became something fragile, held together by a thread of mutual denial. I threw myself into repairing what I could, but a part of me knew it would never be the same. Even now, I think about her, about the way she made me feel, the way she made me see myself in a light I hadn't before. I wonder if she thinks about me, if she regrets what we had, or if she cherishes it the way I do. I'll never know. But one thing is certain: I'll never be the same.